The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the base as the young recruit, Thomas, stood nervously at attention. His heart pounded in his chest like a drumbeat, the fear of the unknown gripping his very soul. He had always dreamed of being a soldier, of fighting for his country. But now in the cold reality of boot camp, those dreams felt distant, almost unreachable. Every morning began with the relentless sound of a drill sergeant's whistle. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, metal, and tension. Thomas was just one of many young men and women who had joined, eager to serve but unaware of the true price of the uniform. Some of them wore smiles, others were hardened. Yet none of them could hide the fear in their eyes. Fear that, like him, they weren't ready for what was about to come. The first few weeks were grueling. Thomas struggled with everything: the physical demands, the endless hours of training, the mental exhaustion that made every moment feel like an eternity. He had been pushed to his limits, his body aching in places he didn't know existed. But the hardest battle wasn't physical. It was the battle inside him. The one where his mind kept telling him he wasn't cut out for this life. The thought of quitting was always there. It whispered in the back of his mind during every drill, every exercise, every sleepless night. Maybe I don't belong here, he'd think. Maybe I'm not strong enough. He wasn't like the others, strong, confident, and seemingly born for this. He felt like an outsider, a boy who had no place on this battlefield. It wasn't long before the doubts started to show. During a field exercise, when everyone else was running through the mud and obstacles with ease, Thomas hesitated. His legs wavered, his arms heavy. The others passed him, their faces determined, while his mind screamed at him to give up. He thought he saw disappointment in the eyes of his fellow recruits, even in the eyes of his instructor, and it stung more than he expected. That evening, alone in his barracks, Thomas sat on his bunk, his head buried in his hands. "What am I doing here?" he asked himself, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a 1,000-pound stone. The dream he had once cherished now felt like a far-off fantasy, slipping away with every passing moment. But then, there was something deep inside him that sparked. It wasn't a flash of brilliance or some sudden epiphany. It was quieter than that, a whisper in the stillness. He remembered why he had joined the army in the first place. He thought about his family, his mother who had always told him to be brave, his father who had served before him, and his younger sister who looked up to him. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for them. He was fighting for something bigger than fear, bigger than the doubts that had consumed him. He wiped away the tears that had threatened to fall and clenched his fists, silently vowing to push forward. "I will not quit," he promised. "Not today, not ever." The next morning, Thomas rose early. The sun was barely creeping over the horizon, and his muscles screamed in protest as he stepped onto the training grounds. He wasn't sure if he was ready, but he had decided that ready or not, he was going to give it his all. The others were already moving, already tackling the course with energy he couldn't yet comprehend. But Thomas, despite the weight of his doubts, followed. He pushed through the pain, one step at a time. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't felt before: hope. The days turned into weeks, and slowly Thomas began to change. The fear that had once crippled him started to fade, replaced by something stronger. It wasn't perfection, He still stumbled, still struggled with many of the obstacles, but something was shifting inside of him. He wasn't just moving through the motions anymore. He was growing. His fellow recruits began to notice the change. Where once he had been the one lagging behind, now he was keeping up. His strides were longer, his breath steadier, his resolve harder. He still wasn't the strongest, the fastest, or the most talented, but he had learned to fight, to dig deep and find a strength within himself he hadn't known existed. It was during one of the toughest drills yet, a 12-mile march through the roughest terrain they had encountered, that Thomas truly understood what had changed. The air was thick with dust, and the ground beneath his boots was uneven and treacherous. His pack felt heavier with each step, and every muscle in his body screamed for relief. The sounds of other soldiers grumbling in frustration surrounded him, but Thomas kept his eyes forward, his focus sharpened. He was no longer fighting just the terrain or the distance. He was fighting his own limitations. Halfway through, fatigue started to sink in. His legs trembled, his vision blurred. His thoughts wandered back to the days when he'd wanted to quit. The whispers of failure threatened to return. "You can't do this. You're not good enough. Just stop." But instead of listening, he pressed on. The sound of his breath in the cold morning air became his rhythm, his mantra. One more step, one more step. And then something happened. The doubt started to fade. The pain became less important. The weight of the pack felt lighter, not because it had changed, but because he had. His mind was no longer focused on the struggle. It was focused on the victory that lay ahead. He wasn't just walking to finish. He was walking to prove something to himself. With every mile, his confidence grew. By the time he crossed the finish line, breathless and aching, he was no longer the unsure recruit he had once been. He was a soldier, seasoned by adversity, hardened by the battles within himself. He had conquered his fear, and in doing so, had become something greater than he ever imagined. The transition from training to active duty wasn't easy. Even after all the hours of drills, the grueling physical tests, the endless mental conditioning, nothing could truly prepare Thomas for what awaited him at the battlefield. The sounds of gunfire, the screams of comrades in distress, the relentless tension in the air. These were the things no one could teach you in boot camp. The first time Thomas was deployed, he felt an unfamiliar sense of unease settle in his chest. Despite the growth he had gone through in training, facing a real enemy was different. It wasn't just the physical danger that worried him. It was the fear of failure, of not being able to protect the men and women beside him. He was still that young recruit deep inside, terrified of letting them down. But when the first shots rang out, everything changed. The fear didn't vanish. It was there, stronger than ever. But in that moment, Thomas made a decision, the decision to push forward, to take action despite his fear. They were pinned down in a narrow alley, the sound of bullets ricocheting off the walls all around them. His heart raced in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins as he crouched behind a wall, trying to steady his breathing. His hands trembled and his thoughts felt scattered. He could hear his comrades shouting orders, but everything seemed muffled, distant. "Focus, Thomas," he told himself. "You've trained for this. You've been through worse." As if answering his inner call, a teammate shouted, "Cover me!" The order jolted him back into action. Without thinking, without hesitation, Thomas sprang into motion, providing cover fire as his teammate moved forward to flank the enemy position. The fear was still there, clawing at him from within, but he had learned how to ignore it. He had learned how to act in the face of it. Time seemed to slow down. Each moment was suspended in fear and chaos, yet somehow Thomas was calm. His training kicked in. His shots were precise, his movements instinctive. He wasn't just following orders anymore. He was leading himself. His heart, which once raced with uncertainty, now beat with purpose. After what felt like an eternity, the firefight ended. The enemy had been repelled, and Thomas's team had secured the position. He stood there, breathing heavily, his body covered in dust and sweat, his face streaked with blood. But in that moment, there was no fear. There was no uncertainty. There was only relief and pride. He had done it. He had faced the battlefield and come out on top, not because he was the best soldier, but because he had refused to let fear control him. And that, more than any physical skill, was what made him a warrior. The weeks that followed were filled with more combat, more challenges. As Thomas rose through the ranks, his reputation as a brave and reliable soldier spread throughout the unit. But every victory came with its price. Every battle, no matter how successful, left scars, some visible, some hidden. Thomas became familiar with loss. He lost comrades, friends, brothers and sisters in arms. The weight of grief settled heavy on his heart, and there were nights when he could barely sleep, haunted by the faces of those who didn't make it back. One night, after a particularly fierce skirmish, Thomas sat alone in the corner of the barracks, staring at the small dog tags in his hand. They belonged to Sergeant Hargrove, a leader he had come to respect deeply. Hargrove had saved Thomas's life more than once, and had always been the calm in the chaos of war. But now the sergeant's dog tags felt cold in his hand, a reminder of the fragility of life on the front lines. Tears stung his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. In the quiet of the night, he whispered, "I'll keep fighting for you, for all of you." The grief would never go away. It couldn't. But Thomas had learned something powerful in that moment. He had learned that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about continuing to fight, even when the pain felt unbearable. It was about honoring those who had fallen by standing tall and carrying on. As time passed, Thomas's transformation continued. He was no longer just a soldier. He had become a leader, the kind of leader who inspired others to push through their own doubts and fears. His journey wasn't defined by his physical strength. It was defined by his resolve, his willingness to endure, and his unyielding love for his country and his comrades. One evening, during a particularly tough mission, Thomas found himself leading a small group of soldiers on a recon mission in enemy territory. The mission was risky and the stakes were high. There was no room for error. As they moved silently through the woods, Thomas kept his eyes peeled, every muscle in his body alert. He could feel the weight, the responsibility pressing down on him. He knew that the lives of his team depended on his decisions, his ability to lead with clarity and strength. Suddenly, a shot rang out from the darkness. His team scattered, seeking cover. But in that instant, Thomas's mind was clear. He didn't hesitate. He barked orders with the authority of a seasoned leader, directing his soldiers with precision and confidence. They moved as one, a well-oiled machine. Together, they took down the threat, securing the mission's success. Afterward, as they made their way back to base, Thomas felt a sense of pride wash over him. He wasn't the boy who had joined the army, unsure of himself and terrified of the challenges ahead. He was a man, strong, confident, and unwavering. He had grown into the kind of leader who could inspire others to be better, to be braver, to be more than they ever thought they could be. The greatest test of Thomas's courage came not on the battlefield, but in a moment that would shape him forever. During an intense operation, the unit was ambushed. The enemy overwhelmed them with force, and the situation quickly turned desperate. Thomas's team was cut off, surrounded on all sides. The air was thick with smoke and the sound of gunfire, and there was no clear path to safety. As the team's leader, it was his responsibility to get them out. The stakes were higher than ever. The lives of his comrades rested on his shoulders. But in that moment of chaos, when it seemed like all hope was lost, Thomas did something unexpected. He made the hardest decision of his life. He stayed behind to cover the retreat of his team. The final moments were a blur of action. He fired relentlessly at the advancing enemy, ensuring that his comrades could escape to safety. His heart was racing, but there was no fear. There was only determination. As the dust settled and the sound of battle died down, Thomas lay there battered and bloodied, but alive. He had made the ultimate sacrifice for his team, his country, and everything he believed in. The days after the battle were a blur of recovery and reflection. Thomas had made it through, but the cost had been high. He had been gravely injured in the final moments of the ambush, his body bruised and battered, his spirit shaken. But despite everything, he was alive, and so were his teammates. The doctors told him he was lucky, but to Thomas, luck had nothing to do with it. He had been driven by something deeper than chance, by a commitment to protect, a love for his comrades that transcended fear. His wounds would heal in time, but the emotional scars, the trauma of the decisions he had made, would take longer. Yet even in that moment of pain, he knew one thing for sure. He had fulfilled his purpose. The journey wasn't over for Thomas. The road to recovery would be long, but with every passing day, he regained more of himself. The strength he had once found on the battlefield was now channeled into his personal healing, both physical and emotional. His comrades rallied around him, offering support, and for the first time, Thomas realized just how deeply he had impacted those around him. He had become the heart of his unit, a symbol of resilience and unwavering commitment. Though he could no longer lead on the front lines immediately, Thomas found new ways to contribute. He began mentoring younger recruits, sharing the lessons he had learned from his own struggles. He taught them that being a hero wasn't about being fearless. It was about fighting through the fear, about finding courage when everything seemed impossible. Months passed, and Thomas's wounds healed. But what had begun as a journey of physical recovery transformed into something far greater, a journey of the soul. He had learned that true strength came not from the body, but from within. It came from the ability to keep going when everything in you screamed to stop, from the determination to rise after every fall. When he finally returned to duty, it was with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a mentor, a guide, a hero in his own right. His reputation had grown, and the respect he had earned was unparalleled. More than that, he had found a peace within himself. He no longer measured his worth by victories or the number of battles fought. Instead, he measured it by the lives he had touched, the hearts he had inspired, and the strength he had shared with those who needed it most. As Thomas returned to the front lines for a final mission, the fear that had once plagued him was gone. It had been replaced with something much stronger, a deep sense of responsibility. He was not just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for his people, for the men and women who stood beside him. He was fighting to honor every sacrifice made before him and to ensure a future worth living for. The mission was intense, but this time Thomas led with confidence, a leader who had come full circle. His soldiers trusted him because they saw in him not just a warrior, but a man who understood the true cost of war and the power of resilience. When the mission was over and the smoke of battle cleared, Thomas stood among his team, victorious once again. But this time, it wasn't the victory that felt most important. It was the journey itself, the journey from a scared, uncertain recruit to a leader who had inspired a generation of soldiers. He had come to understand that heroism was not about grand gestures or glory. It was about perseverance, sacrifice, and the quiet courage to keep moving forward, no matter the cost. As he looked out across the battlefield, he thought of his family, of his teammates, and of every soldier who had ever fought beside him. They were all part of the same story. They were all heroes in their own right. Thomas had found what he had been searching for all along, not just his strength, but purpose. And as he stood tall, his heart filled with pride, he knew that his journey wasn't just his own. It was the story of every soldier, every hero who had ever fought for something greater than themselves. Years passed, and the story of Thomas, the once frightened recruit who had become a legend, spread far and wide. His name became synonymous with courage, not because of his victories, but because of the unwavering heart with which he fought. He became a mentor to those who followed in his footsteps, teaching them not just how to fight, but how to live with honor, integrity, and bravery. Even in his final years of service, Thomas never forgot the lessons that had shaped him. He remained humble, ever mindful of the sacrifices made by those who came before him. And when it came time for him to leave the army, he did so with a heart full of pride. His legacy, forged in the fires of war, would live on in the hearts of the soldiers he had mentored and in the stories passed down through generations. The hero's journey is never truly over. Thomas had learned that in the trenches of war, it wasn't about who stood tall in the moment of glory. It was about who kept going when it seemed impossible. And in that sense, he had never truly stopped being a hero.